Well, tonight we're going to we're going to finish the end of the age series. But it's okay. The world's not going to end at the end of this. So I don't think it will. It could at any moment. But uh, we're going to finish this up tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about the Great Tribulation and specifically the Great Tribulation that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this in our Revelation series that we'll start in a couple weeks. And I need to make an announcement, but I'm going to do that at the end so I don't have to edit it out of the video. But we'll start Revelation in a couple weeks, and we'll talk more about what this tribulation thing is. But what we want to focus on tonight is we've been focusing on Matthew 24. So Jesus uses the phrase Great Tribulation. Now, he doesn't call it the Great Tribulation, but he does use, he says, for then there will be great tribulation. So he's talking about this time period. And if you remember, we kind of split the passage up to try to make it a little more clear. So in Matthew 24, or as it's called, the Olivet Discourse, because it took place on the Mount of Olives, Jesus is answering the questions of his disciples. Remember, there's 4 disciples, or at least a minimum of 4, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And they've just heard Jesus talk about the destruction of the temple, so they ask, when's this going to happen? What will be the signs that will tell us this is about to happen? So he starts off with the near term, and this is the Great Tribulation part he's talking about. And he talks about there being signs in the land, so there'll be wars and rumors of wars, and there'll be kingdoms fighting each other and all these different things. There's going to be signs in the temple. The temple's going to be desecrated, which is going to lead to its destruction. And there'll be weird stuff going on in the heavens. You'll see some strange things happening with the sun and the moon and the stars, and then in the clouds. And he describes the Son of Man coming with the clouds, which is a judgment term. This part is not him coming back to earth. It's him judging Israel, and that's displayed in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So he describes this as a time of great tribulation, and he says at the end of that section that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So all these things are those things on that list in the first 34 verses. And he says all those things were going to happen in the generation that those disciples were living in. Okay, so he says within 40 years, you guys, this is going to happen. And in AD 70, all of these events were completed. They did happen. We have historical record of what happened in Jerusalem at that time. So that was near term for the disciples. Then he makes a transition and he says, now there's coming a day, and he describes it as a single day, not many days with all the different things going on and signs and all that. And this event is his final return, the final judgment, when Jesus returns to earth and he takes the wicked out of his kingdom and the new creation is inaugurated. Okay, so we're still on the same page here. We kind of understand the separation here. So this is a single day, no signs. It's going to come like a thief. You won't know when it's coming. It's just going to happen. Matter of fact, it kind of sounds like we're all going to be thinking everything's fine. And then it's going to happen. Because he describes it as like the days of Noah when everyone's eating and drinking and getting married and just having a good honky-dory time. And then the flood came and took them all away. And he says when he returns on that day, he calls it a singular day, you won't have any clue that it's about to happen. So that's a different event than this event. Okay, so this one was going to happen within 40 years. This one is still in our future. We good? Okay, I just want to make sure we're caught up and got that in our head. Now, what we want to do tonight is I want to talk to you about this great tribulation that Jesus talked about. Not the great tribulation that the Left Behind series talks about. The great tribulation that Jesus talks about, which he describes in this passage, right? This sounds pretty bad. It sounds like a time of great tribulation. Okay, so if you're looking at the notes in the app or either the PDF, I've got a lot of stuff at the beginning there. I'm not going to cover that all in detail. We can discuss it. We can discuss it afterwards if we need to. But what I want to do tonight, just to kind of set up our format, I want let me kind of teach through this. And if you have a question, we can stop and answer it. But it would be better for me tomorrow if I don't have to chop the video up 35 times. So if you can, hold your question to the end. But if it's something that like you're just really confused and you're going to be lost if you don't get the answer, then interrupt me and we'll answer it. We can fix the video if we need to. So that's kind of how we're going to do it if we can. So what I want to do is I want to get the first century events, the history, in your head. So we're going to do some history tonight. Now, how many of you like history? Oh, well, a good bit of you. Good. That's good. I never liked history growing up. Like in school, I just never was good at it. I couldn't remember all these names and dates and places and all that. But in my study of the Bible, I have grown to really love biblical history. So I've spent a lot of time reading writings from the time period, reading about historical events that the Bible is speaking to or predicting, like in the book of Daniel, for instance. But I've spent a good bit of time learning the events that Jesus is describing here that occurred within 40 years, just like he said it would happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the historical events of what happened. And the reason why it's important, we'll talk about it more at the end, it's important for us to have history in our head because it's the backdrop behind the passages of Scripture we're reading. If you don't know the history, you'll take the passages out of context and apply them to something else when it might be applied to something that's already happened in history. You see how that could happen? So we kind of understand this with other parts of the Bible, but when we get to passages like these, we tend to yank them out and like throw them into the future somewhere, and we're not even sure what we're throwing them at because those things haven't happened, you know. So what I want to do is get the history in your head. Now, you don't have to remember all the details of what we're going to talk about tonight. They're all written out in your notes for you to look at later if you want to. I'm not going to go through everything in the notes or we'd be here a long time. But I do want you to understand what great tribulation Jesus was talking about. All right? So now there's a couple questions at the beginning of the notes, and I'll just answer them quickly. It might spur an argument. Let's argue at the end, and it's okay to argue. There's no problem with that. That's not off limits. I'm just trying to give you the historical facts here. You've probably heard the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, described as a 7-year tribulation. Yes? Right? So there are some views of the end times that describe that what Jesus was talking about here is actually in our future, and it's a 7-year time period. So in their view, all of these things have not happened yet. And what they do is they reinterpret this generation will not pass away. They reinterpret that and kind of pull it out of context and make it say something different. So the popular idea is that there will be a rapture of the church and then there will be 7 years of tribulation. All of that is in our future, and that's what Jesus is talking about. Now, that's not my view. My view is that what Jesus said would happen within 40 years did happen within 40 years. And this part over here is the part that hasn't happened yet. And this is not a new idea. This is actually how the early church interpreted this passage. It really wasn't until the 1800s that the other views started coming in to play. So, and then people started reading this as something in our future and not in our past. So the 7-year tribulation, I gave you a little bit of exercise to do or homework to do, but you might have missed it. It was on the Faith Life app yesterday and today, I think. If you go through your New Testament and you go looking for a 7-year tribulation, you're not going to find it. What you will find, specifically in Revelation, you'll find over and over again that the time period of this horrible tribulation time is 3.5 years. We'll talk about that more at the end. So Jesus doesn't say anything about 7 years, and the New Testament doesn't say anything about 7 years. If you have questions about how that came about, we can talk about that toward the end. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I want to get through this history. Um, so the other question is, where does Great Tribulation appear in the New Testament? So if you're looking at the notes, I gave you the three places where those two words, Great Tribulation, appear. And they only appear 3 times in the New Testament. One of them is in Matthew 24, verse 21, where he says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." So he says this time that he's talking about here, it had never been that bad up to that point, and those things won't happen again. It won't be like that again. Revelation chapter 2, verse 22, this is in one of the letters to the 7 churches. It's talking about a problem in that specific church in the first century of sexual immorality and someone in the church that's encouraging this behavior. He said, Jesus says, "I will throw her onto a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her I will throw into great tribulation unless they repent of her works." So that's the second place it appears. And then in Revelation chapter 7, verse 14, John is talking to the angel that's showing him these visions. And he's just been shown a vision of a great multitude of people in heaven. And the angel asked John, "Do you know who these people are?" And John says, "Well, you know," which I just think that's funny. He's basically like, "How would I know? You're showing me a vision of heaven. How am I supposed to know what's going on? You know, obviously, you're from there, right?" And the angel said to John, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb," which is another funny thing. Made them white in the blood. Okay, all right, we'll just move on. So Great Tribulation, it only appears 3 times. The first time it appears in your New Testament is when Jesus used it, about a time period that was going to happen within 40 years of when he said these words. So that's what we're about to talk about. I'm going to take you through the history of this time period. Okay, so what I did in your notes, there are like event after event, and I put them kind of into a heading under each year of the time period. So there's a lot more in your notes than you see on this chart. Can y'all read that okay? Do I need to zoom in? Can you read it? Okay, I see some of you zooming in like this. So all right, so I'll zoom in as we walk through it. But so the Jewish War, or it's often called the Jewish Revolt, it started up officially in 66 AD. And it spanned 3.5 years of time and was ended in AD 70, or at least it was ended in Jerusalem. Jerusalem fell, it was completely destroyed, temple destroyed in AD 70. There was a group that had gotten out to a place called Masada, which is a big fortress up on a cliff, and they held that till about the year 73 when Rome finally knocked them off the cliff, so to speak. But the main war went from 66 to 70. It was a 3.5 year long period. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a little bit before 66 and just kind of give you some history of what was going on leading up to it, and then we'll dig in. So in 64, Nero, y'all have heard of Nero, Roman emperor. He became emperor in 54, but in 64, he burned Rome. He set Rome on fire. Not by himself. He's the emperor. He can make people do stuff like that. And don't think, like when you hear Roman emperor, don't think president of the United States. We're not even, that's comparing apples to oranges, okay? The emperor, he is a tyrant, if he wants to be. He can do whatever he wants. They had a Senate in Rome. Sound familiar? Senate? That was intended to be more of the governing body, even though they did have an emperor. But that changed very quick. So as soon as that got started, it wasn't long after that, the emperors started calling themselves gods and took over everything. So he becomes emperor in 54, but in 64, he has Rome burned. And his reason for this was he wanted to build better and bigger buildings. And he wanted to build a palace for himself, and he wanted to build a temple for himself. So he burned down major parts of the city of Rome, huge fire, thousands and thousands of people died from it. And because so many people were on to him, I mean, it's not like he stood up and said, I'm going to burn down the city. Like, he acted like he didn't do it. He blamed it on Christians. So that's when the persecution started from Rome's side. Now, up to this point, Christians were already heavily persecuted by the Jewish people. But when Nero burns Rome and blames it on the Christians, it becomes an empire-wide persecution. And I could describe what Nero did to our fellow brothers and sisters back then. It was bad, very graphic. This is the cleanest thing I could tell you. He would have Christians arrested. He would put them on a stake in a courtyard, light them on fire while they're still alive, and that would provide light for his parties. So they would be partying like they always do, with burning people as lamps. That's the nicest part. The other things, I mean, he had people torn apart by wild animals as he stood and laughed. He was called repeatedly by Roman historians the most brutal tyrant that Rome had. So anyway, so he does that and persecution starts. That persecution is going to last for 42 months. He's going to die in 68. Nero's going to commit suicide. We'll get there in a minute. So that persecution from Rome toward the Christians lasted for 42 months, which is also 3.5 years. In 65, if you remember all those crazy signs that I told you were happening that Josephus writes about in his account, he's an eyewitness. He saw these things. In 65, before the war breaks out, there were these strange things that happened. There were 7 of them. And to the people who were paying attention, people who are trying to be faithful to Yahweh, even though they're not Christian, they realize this is bad. These crazy things that are happening is a sign from God that he's about to show up and kick our butts, because we've seen him do this in the past. In the Old Testament, he comes with Babylon. Babylon comes and destroys the temple, so forth. So, but the other group in Jerusalem think this is a good sign that we can overtake the Romans. Little Jerusalem is going to overtake the Roman Empire, right? So there was all kinds of fights and stuff within Jerusalem over that. And in 66, Gessius Florus, he's the governor at the time over Judea. He's a Roman governor. He did quite a few things. One of the things he did was he allowed for defiled sacrifices to be made in the Jewish synagogue in a place called Caesarea. So that obviously going to tick off some Jews. Yes? Yeah. So, and then because of that, he wouldn't even allow them to go back into their synagogue because they were mad and causing an uproar. So that caused a lot of issues. The other thing that he did was he raided the temple in Jerusalem and stole a pile of the money from the treasury in the temple. I've got it on here somewhere. Anyway, I put the amount on here somewhere. I just can't remember where it's at. 17 talents. He stole 17 talents, which means nothing to you, right? That was 340 years worth of wages. That's a lot of dough, right? So he did that. The other thing that he did is he went on like a killing spree for 5 months, and he killed 3,600 people in that 5-month span of time. And what he didn't realize is a lot of them were Roman citizens. He thought he was only having the Jews killed, but he ended up killing some Romans at the same time. So there was a pretty big revolt. There was a group in town in Jerusalem called the Zealots. You've probably read about them in the Gospels. They're mentioned here and there. One of Jesus' disciples was a former zealot. And what zealots are is they're very, very conservative Jews who hate Rome with a passion. So they would plan these like sneak attacks where they would kill a Roman soldier and then they would just kind of blend in with the crowd at one of the big festivals. And that was kind of their way of getting back at Rome. There was an even more sinister side of the Zealots called the Sicarii. And the word Sicarii is the word for dagger. What they would do is they would do the same thing. They would sneak into the festivals. They would be standing in the crowd, and then they would just kill people, blend into the crowd. So kind of a brutal bunch, but they're very conservative Jews, and they hate Rome. They get really ticked off with this Florus guy, this governor, and they start amassing a big following and trying to convince people we really ought to fight against Rome. We need to get them out of our land. They shouldn't be occupying our land. Okay, so that's the beginning of 66. So Nero decides there's all this commotion going on in Judea, where Jerusalem is. I need to send one of my generals down there to straighten this out. So he sends a guy named Cestius Gallus. And so he goes to the land of Judea, and he's kicking butt for about 6 days. So he gets all the way to the temple. All right, on the 6th day, he's all the way at the temple. He's won. Everybody knows he's won. Josephus writes down, he said all he had to do was just walk in. He'd won already. And Josephus says, without any reason in the world, that's a quote, he turned around and fled the city. Now, we don't have a clue what happened. Maybe he saw something. Maybe God had done something in front of him to show him, like, you're messing with the wrong people here or whatever. But he took off and his army went with him. And the Zealots thought, God's on our side. So they chased him down and killed a bunch of them, which only makes Rome even more angry. But what this did is this gave time for anybody in town to get out of town. There was a pause in the war at the very beginning. The days were cut short. Does that sound familiar? Jesus said if these days were not cut short, no one would survive it, right? So there was a pause in this war. This gave time for people to leave. We have historical record from multiple sources that the Christians left Jerusalem because they remembered Jesus told us this was going to happen. We better get out. So they did, and a lot of them went to a place called Pella across the Jordan River. Some of them even went south. So they left town. So during this pause, and the Cestius guy pretty much got his butt handed to him in the wilderness because the Jews chased him down. So Nero decides, I'm going to send a different general named Vespasian. He's going to become emperor later. So he sends him with about 20,000 Roman troops, but on his way, he's amassing troops from all the other nations that Rome occupies. So he's kind of rounding up the nations, so to speak, as he's coming. So he's got 20,000 troops. By the time he gets there, he's got between 30 and 60,000. He's got tons of help. The first thing that he does when he gets there is he starts doing all kinds of things that they normally do during war. They start cutting down trees, they start building what they call siege works. So he's gonna start really kicking butt, and he does. A lot of god-awful things happen. But what he does before he gets to Jerusalem, he's coming from the north because he's coming from Rome. He starts in the Galilee area, where Sea of Galilee is where Josephus actually was living at the time. He starts there, and he's just slaying people. So he starts and he works his way down. And that's when Josephus was captured, by the way. He was captured, and then he was made to be the guy who writes the history. So he starts there, works his way down. Because he's doing that, all these people in these villages flee to Jerusalem. And why would you do that? Well, because Jerusalem is a fortified city. Huge walls, and they think that's the safest place to go. It's certainly better than my puny little house I've got. So a bunch of people just flood into Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is getting packed out. So the other thing that happens, so he's coming from the north. Vespasian's son Titus is in the south in Egypt, and he gets word that he needs to join the battle. So he comes up from the south. So you got Vespasian coming from the north, Titus from the south coming in. Now, what happens during this time when Vespasian is in Galilee, the northern part, and he's working his way down, he's killing so many people at the Sea of Galilee and in the upper Jordan River that downriver, the river is blood. So we have historical accounts that they could tell how far the armies were away by looking at the river. He describes the Sea of Galilee, the shores were filled with bodies and broken down ships because one group tried to flee. They got into their boats and went out on the Sea of Galilee thinking maybe they could get away, and that didn't work out too good for them. About 15,000 Jews died in one day during that Galilee siege. So history tells us the sea was filled with bodies and blood. The river was flowing with blood. It was a pretty tribulation-y time. That's not a word, but you know what I'm saying. So everybody's going to Jerusalem to get away from Vespasian. And then Vespasian starts getting word that up in even farther north in Gaul, there's a revolt going on because people are sick of Nero. Nobody really liked Nero because he was so brutal. He was not only just brutal, he was sexually deviant. So he did a lot of sexual things that I don't want to repeat in here, but they're awful. So nobody really likes Nero. A lot of people are starting revolts against him. Vespasian gets word of this and decides, I need to stop what I'm doing here in Judea, and I need to head to Rome, because he had gotten word that that this was all going on, and Nero ends up killing himself because he knows he's going to be captured anyway. So he leaves, and there's another little break in the war while Titus is working his way up to Jerusalem. All right, it's a lot of information. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to tell you everything, but it's just part of it. So during this time when Nero dies, Rome goes into chaos. You can imagine if your emperor, somebody's trying to take over Rome, your emperor kills himself, it's going to be a mess. So a lot of stuff happened. This is called the Year of Four Emperors, this time between 68 and 69. So let me just kind of give you the rundown of what happened there. A guy named Galba shows up in Rome. Nero kills himself. Galba becomes the 7th emperor, but he's killed only a month later. He's only in power for a month. And a guy named Otho shows up. He takes over as emperor. He's the 8th emperor. Only 4 months later, another guy named Vitellius shows up and kills him. And he becomes the emperor. And then 9 months after that, Vespasian arrives in Rome and kills that guy. Now Vespasian is the emperor. And this starts a new dynasty. So if you know anything about the Caesars, there's the Julius Caesar dynasty, and then it's the Flavian dynasty. So this is what happens when Vespasian takes over. Now, while all this is going on down in Jerusalem, so Rome is in complete turmoil. They're fighting each other, all kinds of stuff going on. Down in Jerusalem, it's only getting worse. Should have been getting better. It's only getting worse. By this time, there were two different groups of people. One guy's name is Simon Bar Giora, and John of Gischala. And these two guys are not on the same team, but they're both in Jerusalem, and they've both got a following of people. So Simon's in the upper city. John has taken over the Temple Mount along with a group of people from Idumea. And what these people are, they're not full-blooded Jews. Some of them aren't Jews at all. And they take over the Temple Mount and desecrate the temple in multiple ways. They have Gentile bloodshed going on in the temple. They're killing people in the temple. They set up a counterfeit priesthood that weren't even from the tribe of Levi. So that, I mean, they've totally messed up the whole temple system. And there's another guy named Eleazar who's working with John. So there's all this crazy stuff going on. Jews murdering each other, the temple's being defiled, a false priesthood has been set up. It's a mess. Sounds like a mess, right? So that's what's going on there. Well, in the year 70, Titus shows up. The first thing he does is he demolishes all the trees in the whole region because he needs to build things to win this war, because Jerusalem is a huge fort, huge, massive walls. So they build these big towers where they can go up and jump over onto the wall, huge, tall towers. They build battering rams so they can beat down parts of the wall. They build catapults so they can throw huge stones over the wall. Most of the time they were set on fire and then thrown over the wall. The other thing they had was something called a ballista, and the nickname for it was Scorpion. They were called Scorpions. And they're like a giant crossbow, but they can throw, I mean, it's bad, okay? You wish you had this crossbow. I mean, it's huge, shoots a long way. So they would set things on fire and shoot them over the walls, shoot them at people on the walls. So they're tearing down all the trees to build all this. Josephus described that. He said the whole region, which was once a flourishing forest around the city, looked like a desert. So all the trees were gone because they're building all this stuff. So Titus shows up. He starts kicking butt. And what happens, remember those two guys, Simon and John, who are in the city and they're fighting each other? John's in the temple, Simon's in the upper city. John had a buddy named Eleazar who was helping him for a while. But then John betrayed Eleazar, and now there's 3 enemies. So now you got 3 different armies of people inside the walls fighting each other. Okay? And then what happens is Eleazar, he's the leader of the Zealots, he decides, I know what we could do to get all these Jews to fight. We'll burn up all the food. Sounds like a great idea, huh? Yeah. But in his mindset, because there's still a whole group of people, big group of people in Jerusalem who want nothing to do with this war. They've been trying to get people to stop this war the entire time. They've got common sense. I mean, it's Rome. We're really going to beat Rome. Let's stop this war. There were also 2 different prophets. They were priests, but they were going around the city prophesying during the entire war that we need to stop this. God is not on our side in this war. Matter of fact, we're pretty sure God is here to kick our butt through the Roman armies. But they never listened to them. So there's a whole group of people that doesn't want to fight. Some of them got killed because they were considered traitors because they wouldn't fight. So Eleazar decides, I know how to get everybody on our side to fight. Burn up the food. Because if there's no food and you know you're going to die, you're going to fight. That's his mindset. So he burns up all the food. There was enough food in there that probably could have lasted them 2 to 3 more years in that city. Because here's what happens. When the Romans show up to a city, they don't just show up and then tear all the walls down and kill everybody. They show up and they build a wall around your wall. They built an 8-kilometer wall around this city when they got there. And they built it in 3 days. That's how many troops they had. So they built this wall all the way around the city, and here's the plan. This was the Roman strategy. We're going to build a wall where you can't get out of the city to find food, and then we're just going to wait. And usually, eventually somebody would walk out with a little white flag. All right, we're hungry. We'd rather be slaves and fed than starve to death. Because if you don't know anything about starvation, when you're shut up in a city and there's perhaps over 1 million people in this city and they're starving to death, you can kind of imagine what happens. Cannibalism set in pretty quick. I could read you the story, but I won't. There's a story where Josephus describes a mother who cooked her child and ate half of it and saved the other half just to scare the other zealots when they came to try to get food from her house. She would say, well, I ate my child, do you want the other half? And they would just puke and run off. Um, this is what happens in times like this. People were they were chewing leather belts trying to get something to eat. So it's bad. It's a real bad deal. So you would think you'd surrender. But did the Jews surrender? No. No. The Zealots, these three factions of people that are fighting each other and also the Romans, they think they're going to win this thing because they're convinced that God's on their side. So they keep fighting. So Titus, his plan was to just starve them out until they surrender. He had no interest in destroying the city or the temple. By the way, he's not even the one who set fire to the temple. The Jews did. They're the ones who defiled their own temple. They're the ones who set it on fire. He just came in, finished the job. So Titus was hoping they would surrender. They would not, so they kept fighting. Eventually, he makes it through the walls, gets to the Temple Mount, sees that it's already been burned. There's thousands and thousands of dead bodies in the temple area. Blood is flowing out over the stairs of the temple. That's how many people. And that was before Titus even got in. The Jews did that to themselves. So it's a really bad time. So he finally gets there. He completely defiled the temple even further by setting up Roman idols in the temple, which was common practice. If you conquer a land, you go into their god's temple, you set up your gods, and then that makes their god not as good as yours. So that's what the Romans did. They brought their idols in, set them up, made sacrifices, sacrificed pigs on the temple altar to their gods. And the soldiers declared Titus emperor and god. Worshipped him as a god because the emperors are gods in their mind. He also did some other awful things with a couple ladies on top of a Torah scroll in the temple. So I would say it got desecrated pretty well. Toward the end of the whole thing, about a third of the people who were living in that area at the time were killed as a result. They didn't get away with it. They were killed. 97,000 were enslaved and taken back to Rome, sold into slavery or paraded down the streets. And that is the 3.5-year war, which was a great tribulation. And it happened, this was AD 70, it was exactly 40 years after AD 30. Jesus made these predictions, and I'm pretty sure AD 30. He's in the week right before he died. So, happened just as Jesus said it would. It was a time of great tribulation, and all these things happened before their generation passed away. So that's the great tribulation that Jesus talked about. So I'll take a break here. Any questions before we move on to the next part? We're almost done. Well, for what we can tell, a majority of them probably went to Pella and hung out there. There's a spring, and it's kind of up in the hills. Jesus said, "Run for the hills." They literally did. So Christians take Jesus literally. I mean, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? So they actually go to the hills. There's a beautiful spring in this place. You can go look at it today. And they hung out there for a while. But Christianity had already spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. The New Testament tells us that. And all of these documents in the New Testament are written before AD 70. So just as Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom will go out through the entire world. The word for world there is oikumene, which means empire, all the known world. So he said this gospel is going to make it through there, and then these things are going to go down. So some of them went to Pella. Many of them had left before this started, like Paul, and there's a good chance Paul and Peter died during this time. So they, sometime between 67, 68, because they died under Nero. So sometime during that 42-month persecution, Peter and Paul died. So we know they were in Rome. Some of the others were still in Jerusalem when the war started. But yeah, so they would have probably hung out in Pella for a while, but they were pretty spread out already. Yeah. So in 66, when they saw armies surrounding Jerusalem, which is literally what Jesus said would happen, they were like, "Oh, we heard about this. Let's head out." So and there's no telling. We don't know how many. I mean, they had almost 40 years of time to gain a lot of followers and tell them what was going to happen. So, but yeah, they're pretty spread out, best we can tell. The two prophets, yeah. There was two priests that were ousted from the priesthood when the Zealots took over and set up their own priesthood. These two guys, I listed them in your notes somewhere. Oh yeah, it's under the 68 section there. Ananus, I'm probably saying that wrong, and Joshua, although Josephus calls him Jesus, but it's not the Jesus. There are a lot of people named Jesus in that time. The name Jesus is the Greek rendition of the word Joshua, Yeshua. So Ananus and Joshua are two priests, and they had been saying the entire time during the war, we need to stop this foolishness. God is not on our side. This is God's judgment on us. We need to stop this. And nobody listened. Eventually, Eleazar, the guy who's around the temple area at the time, had both of them killed. And then he would not let them be buried. So they put their bodies out in the streets, and people mocked them. The zealots stood by and mocked and laughed and all that. So that's the two priests who were prophesying. So I think I put prophets there, but their official role was they were priests when Jerusalem still had the right priesthood going on. So yeah, that's what that is. They were the two guys who were prophesying at the time. But yeah, they were killed. Their bodies were put in the street, and everybody laughed. But it doesn't say how long they were there. Any other questions? All right. Well, let's talk about toward the end of your notes there. Why are these events important? Here's why. Because if you're not a history person, you're probably thinking, okay, well, fine, but why does it matter? Well, to me, it matters because knowing this really builds my confidence. Not that I need it anymore, but it builds my confidence that when Jesus says something's going to happen, it's going to happen in this time frame. Knowing that this history went just how he said it was going to go, that helps us understand that's more proof that Jesus was accurate in the things that he said. So I've had people who aren't believers, and they say, well, Jesus said all these things and they never happened. And I'm like, oh, yeah, they did. Actually, you should study history. They all happened exactly like he said, and they happened in the time frame he said they would happen. So to me, that it's good for us to know that. It's also good for us to know that we need to know this separation, because from this section over here is what everybody's posting about on Facebook right now. Have you noticed that? A lot of Matthew 24 is ending up on Facebook, wars and rumors of wars and all that. We need to understand that Jesus was describing events that would happen in the disciples' lifetime. Okay? So don't pull a verse out of context and apply it to things that it may not apply to. So just be careful with that. The second reason that I think this is really important is because there are multiple details in this time period that match up with other things in your New Testament. Anybody want to guess what book that might be? In Revelation, yes. If you'll notice here, there's a 42-month persecution. That shows up in Revelation, a 42-month persecution. A 5-month battle, 5 months of terror, that shows up. 3.5 years shows up. So the reason I want you to have this in your head is because there's a lot of connections here with things that are talked about in the book of Revelation. Now, before I go any further, let me be very clear. There are things in Revelation that have not happened yet. Okay? I'm not a hyper-preterist. That's a group of people that they think everything in the Bible's already happened, and we're in the new heavens and new earth now. I don't go there. Okay? If this is the new deal, this is not what he said it was going to be. Okay? So there are things in Revelation. I'm gonna tell you more about that as we do Revelation. But there are things in Revelation that match up quite nicely with these events, and we'll talk about them as we get into that. But I want you to have this stuff in your head. It's important to have history in your head because the Bible was written in history, and there's a cultural background that goes with it that helps us understand it even more clearly. So that's the other reason I want you to know this. Now, if you look in your notes, there's some numbers to remember. I've already gave some of this away, but so you're going to see as we get into Revelation, you're going to see numbers like 1,260 days. Anybody want to do some math real quick? How long is that in years? 1,260 days. 3.5 years. 42 months is 3.5 years. Okay? So you're going to see those two numbers in Revelation. You're going to see 3.5 years in Revelation, and you're going to see time, times, and half a time. Time, times, and half a time. 3.5 years. So you're going to see that. You're going to see 5 months is going to show up. You're going to see twice 10,000. It's 20,000. It's the number of troops mentioned in Revelation. You're also going to hear about a sixth emperor or a sixth king. 5 have fallen and 1 currently is, and then the next one won't be there for long. So we're going to talk about that when we get there. And then the number 1/3 is going to show up in Revelation a lot. So just keep those numbers in your head. Just remember these numbers because all these numbers, sorry, I thought I had this list up there, but the numbers I just told you are all numbers that exist in this 3.5-year war. They also show up in Revelation in several places. So it'll help you to have that in your head because these things could be connected. So we'll talk about that more in the next series. Okay, let me give you your homework, and then I'll stop and we can have Q&A, or nobody wants to have Q&A, you can leave. It doesn't matter. So let me give you your homework. Now, when I say this, you're going to automatically think you can't do this. But here's what I want you to do. You're going to have 2 weeks. I want you to read the entire book of Revelation. Now, immediately you think, oh, that's so much. You can read the entire thing start to finish in 50 minutes. Not 15, 50. So it'll take you about an hour. For some of you, it might be an hour and a half. It's okay. I'm a slow reader too. You can read the entire book of Revelation in that time period. So you've got 2 weeks, so you could do it a few times. I would encourage you to read it a few times. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to read Revelation in a paper Bible with a pen. And I want you to just underline things or circle things that are interesting to you. There's going to be a lot of interesting things in there. Specifically, I want you to underline or circle any numbers that show up. There's a lot of numbers in there. Just circle them, pay attention to them. Just kind of have it rolling around in your head. So I want you to read Revelation. You're going to have 2 weeks because next week we're doing the Passover meal at Cross Point. Okay? So if you haven't got on our calendar and RSVP for that, please do. You have until Sunday to decide if you're going to go. But we won't be here next week. But after that, we'll start the Revelation series. So you got 2 weeks to read it. But I want you to specifically focus on the first 20 verses. That's chapter 1 of Revelation. Okay, so maybe you're like, I don't know if I can get all the way through this. Then at least at minimum, read chapter 1 several times and just see what you can learn. Pay close attention. Don't just read it and then put it down. Like, read it slow, pay attention, see what's going on. Because chapter 1 actually teaches us a lot of things about how to read the rest of the book. John loves to write things this way, by the way. If you read John's gospel, in chapter 1, he gives you a bunch of words and phrases that he's going to bring up through the rest of the gospel. It kind of works like Genesis. Remember, Genesis gives you all these patterns and words and phrases that keep coming up throughout the story. John writes the same way. He does it in his gospel, and he does it in chapter 1 of Revelation. So pay attention to chapter 1 and just see what you can learn from that. Anything confusing, just make a note. We can discuss it. What we're going to do in the first part of the Revelation series is I'm going to give you kind of an introduction. I'm going to tell you different ways that people look at the book. And I'll tell you which one I kind of align with most closely, although I don't pick a view because I think all the views are wrong in some area. I think sometimes we pick a view and then we start reading the Bible through the view. And that's not the way I want to do it. That's backwards. So we're going to talk about that some. But in the second part of our Revelation series, we're really going to dig into chapter 1 and learn how to read the whole book. Okay? So pay attention to chapter 1. Now, if you want extra credit, there's some passages I put in the notes here from Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 46. That's Daniel's vision of the big statue, and he's interpreting the vision for the king. And each part of the statue has a different type of material. Read that passage and read what the angel says to Daniel. He interprets the vision for Daniel. The reason why I'm telling you to do this is because it helps you learn how to read apocalyptic literature, vision literature. Because Daniel is great for this. Because if you read Daniel, you start realizing, what he's seeing is not the real thing. What he's seeing represents something real. You'll see it as you read Daniel. So if you do the extra credit, you're going to be smarter. So whatever. And if you really want to go big or go home, just read chapter 7 of Daniel all the way through the end. And then as we read Revelation, you'll notice a lot of similarities. So Daniel's going to help you learn how to read Revelation. All right, so that's your homework. You got 2 weeks to do all of that, and I'll post some things throughout to kind of remind you to do it. And I might give you some hints of things to pay attention to. So let me just say this before I stop. We're about to get into Revelation in a couple weeks. And just understand that we need to be open-minded. I don't think anyone has Revelation completely figured out. Now, I'm not the only one saying that. There are people who are, serious Bible scholars who would say the same thing, that we should be very open-handed about this. Like, we kind of think it looks like this, but it also could be this over here. We just have to be okay with that in Revelation, all right? So now there are people out there who they think they've got it all figured out and they know what it is, and the Locust or Cobra helicopters that are going to kill us all from Russia, they've got it all figured out, and you can go watch them on YouTube all day long. That's not the way we should be looking at this, okay? By the way, every generation thought they had it figured out, okay? The 10 kings in Revelation used to be the 10 nations who joined NATO. That was the big interpretation when NATO came out. But then guess what happened? There were more than 10 shortly after. And that interpretation got abandoned. You don't read about it anymore. So if you're not careful, you end up having to completely redo your thinking on the book every time another event happens. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to read headlines in the news and then look at the Bible. We want to look at the Bible and have it help us see what the headlines are about. Make sense? Okay? So let's just be open-minded about this as we get into it. That's the ground rules, okay? We can debate and discuss, but let's commit that we're going to study this for ourselves, not just believe what somebody else has told us, okay? All right, any questions before we end? All right, so I'll take that as you have questions you'll stay after for. That's okay too. We'll stay here as long as you need to. All right, let me pray for us, and then we'll head out.